So thank you very much for coming today, for being present. We have an amazing afternoon visiting labs with our students from the Convergence course. We're very happy, and we would like to start to saying thanks to the people that make this possible in the BRAIN program of the Research Institute of the McGill University Health Center, which opened 5 different labs for our students to go and visit what scientists do in research in the normal basis. And we are extremely happy today to have a very special speaker. This is an occasion that we usually get neuroscientists or artists that work in the crossover between the disciplines of art and science. We think in Convergence that is really important for expand the knowledge and the understanding between different disciplines. And today we have Darian Goldin Stahl, who we have the lab to meet through Rebecca. And Rebecca made the contacts with Bill, who is present here too, to open his lab to allow Darian to do a residency from September to December of last year. So Darian is a Ph.D. Candidate in the Humanities programs in Concordia University. And she is a printmaker. She comes from the United States, and she has been doing her research here in Canada. She has a lot of connection with patient illness and how materials have an influence in this kind of states with the patient, especially with the research that she has done with her sister who have multiple sclerosis. So the visit to the lab that was able to make possible some convergence of the and Hugh was to explore a little bit of how reproductive aspects of multiple sclerosis also play in this role and materials implicated in that. So I'm super happy to introduce you, and we will listen from you now. So
great, thank you. And let me test if this microphone works. Hello? Hello? Christian? Does it work? Oh, whoa. Okay.
Whoa.
Now it works. All right. Thank you for that introduction, Christian. And my name is Darian Goldin Stahl. And my background is in printmaking and medical humanities. So I'll just jump right in. The progress of medicine can be understood by its images. From the drawn, engraved, or etched representations of the body, printed and bound into tomes by collaborating teams of anatomists, physicians, and printmakers, to the extraordinary scans produced by penetrating waves of magnetic resonance. These visualizations teach us not only about the body, but how Western culture represents and proves its research findings to others. With every new advancement of imaging technology, the scale of science has been getting smaller, more focused, sliced ever thinner, until the frame of research exists entirely within the realm of the unseen. This extreme cropping, if I may term it, forms an effective focal point for the proof of new knowledge. Ooh. Maybe the other way?
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's much nicer. Thank you. For the researchers who wish to communicate their findings, because this information may make our communities healthier, allow us to lead more fulfilling lives, or enable us to pursue our passions, the barriers to effective communication can be quite high. This is due in part, I argue, to the images they point to as proof, whose meaning remains generally unintelligible to anyone without immense amounts of specialized knowledge. In short, images like these leave out the bigger picture. I find myself in this outsider position within my interdisciplinary printmaking practices. First, with my long-standing collaboration with my sister, Dr. Devan Stahl, who is a clinical bioethicist, a hospital chaplain, has multiple sclerosis, and is a prospective mother. And most recently, in my collaborative artist residency with scientists at the McGill University Fertility Research Lab. This paper explores the connections between these two different collaborative practices and asks questions like, what is at stake when the images of medicine and science only speak to each other? How can these images be deconstructed and recontextualized in ways that refocus on the bigger picture? And finally, what are the implications of restructuring these images on these subjects, makers, and audiences of these scans? I also explore how reimagining laboratory images through research creation reveals the networks of materials and non-human bodies that undergird scientific research. By creating interdisciplinary SciArt, I explore how visual metaphor, composition, and embodied engagement are also practices reconstructing primary knowledge with researchers and those who seek healing. Before jumping into the outcomes of this latest artist in residence position, I think it is very necessary to show how my history of collaboration has gone in to inform these final images. My investigations into the images of medicine began some 4 years after my sister Devan's diagnosis of multiple sclerosis in 2009. In those initial years after she was diagnosed, I was voiceless. Unlike my sister, who had already attained a Master's of Divinity from Baylor University and was working towards her Ph.D. in medical ethics, I did not possess the written or oratory skills necessary to adequately talk about illness. Even if I was able to ask Devan how it felt being transformed into a medical object, undergoing invasive testing or years of medical trials just to be able to afford her medication, living with an uncertain body and even more murky future, I would not have known what to do with those answers. I imagine that she must have felt alone in those first years. An isolation poignantly perpetuated by our family's almost acrobatic maneuvers to make everything seem fine. The distance between silence and openness began to close when my sister started sharing with me her autoethnographic academic papers that she was writing for conferences and publications. Written from her extremely unique perspective of a hospital chaplain, bioethics scholar, and patient, her words shed light on the lack of empathy for patients from her first-person perspective. This was actually the first time I'd ever heard her talk about her illness, and she explained to me at the same time as all the other conference goers in the room the vulnerability she felt being diagnosed and how her sense of self was completely changed after viewing her scans. In her diagnosis narrative, she revealed the vulnerability she felt when her tactless neurologist pointed to dim spots between blurs of gray in her scans in order to come up with his final diagnosis. And how, in this life-altering moment of incredible distress, she asked him how he could be sure, since she had been given many diagnoses before this point. His response, managing to never take his eyes off the computer screen while also pushing a box of tissues her way, was, "I'm a specialist. I know what I'm looking for." She explained the powerlessness she felt in that moment because she lacked the specialized knowledge necessary to read her own body scans and see the lesions that grew along her brain and spine. This, along with her neurologist's apparent lack of compassion or willingness to help her understand what he saw in that moment, compounded an already traumatic event. Knowing my own interest in the historical intersections of printmaking and anatomy, Devan procured a CD of her MRI scans from her neurologist and gave them to me. She believed that I, as her sister, would see her body very differently than her doctors, and that I could approach them with more empathy and reconstruct them in ways that spoke to her lived experiences. Looking through these scans for the first time, I had no clue how they were made, why they look the way they do, why some tissues shine bright and others fall away completely. nor could I decipher the lines of coded words and text, numbers, bar graphs along each scan, and ultimately if they meant anything for my sister's prognosis. I still don't know where the lesions are. I don't know. But those are all questions for her neurologist. As an artist, I am far more interested in how the scans cut right through her eyes, how they crop her limbs at the joints or capture the curve of her ear. I am not interested in diagnosing Devan. I am interested in understanding the impact of these images on her sense of identity and agency. Scrolling through her scans, I felt the urgent need to communicate her narratives through the addition of drawing and printmaking. I decided to use my own skin to cover Devan's fleshless scans. One, because my body is available to me in ways that my sister's is not. She lives in a different country, but also as an act of embodied caregiving. After many failed experiments and attempts to discover a common language between MRI scans and my own skin, I finally discovered a way of scanning my flesh through drawing. So for this process, I dust powdered charcoal over sheets of newsprint, give them a little shimmy like this until there's just the finest layer of charcoal covering the newsprint paper. I then press or roll my body over the surface of the paper, and the oils of my skin and the texture of my hair and clothes lift the charcoal off the paper and leave a bright negative impression of my body. The pores of my skin, the creases of my lips, and to my horror, the hair along my chin are all here in amazing clarity. So this was rolling my body continuously over the paper and photographing it. This monstrous pulling apart and duplicating and flattening of my rolled body in the charcoal, I see as evoking the discomfort my sister has while in the MRI machine and the othering that occurs when viewing the unsettling scans. After photographing these delicate drawings, I then layer in my sister's MRI scans through the printmaking process. Here is a digital print. The scans in these are quite subtle, but you might be able to see. Oh, I have a laser. This one here. There's this one here. General. So I'll just print here. This is another one using silkscreen as my printmaking process. Stone lithography. And encaustic toner transfer. This joining of her scan and my skin seems to create a new figure who materializes our efforts to represent the patient body. Although Devan switched neurologists, good riddance, the vulnerability she experienced to reduce the images of medicine, unfortunately, did not end there. I would like to read now a short narrative that Devan has written, and it really affected me and changed a lot of my artwork and research since that point. The whole MRI production begins at the hospital, a fine place to be if you work there, but a dreadful one if you are ill. After filling out my preliminary intake forms, I'm asked to undress and put on a hospital gown. 2 if the gown is flimsy. Better safe than sorry. I have found the standards for the clothes I can wear during the exam vary depending on the lab. I once had a rather gauche conversation with a radiology technician about my bra. He was an older, slightly grisly-looking man who introduced himself by asking where I bought my bra. In my vulnerable position, I did not immediately ask why he wanted to know. I assumed he was a professional with a point. He may have actually just been a pervert. Apparently, Victoria's Secret bras, which are the standard for 20-somethings, use a plastic underwire, which is perfectly fine in the MRI scanner. Regardless, he informed me, A metal underwire, like the metal zipper and buttons on my jeans, would only mildly vibrate during the exam, quote, which some women rather enjoy. This comment left me in the rather awkward position of having to decide whether I should leave my clothes on and allow this man to think I was enjoying the exam, or take them off and feel cold for the next 2 hours. It never ceases to amaze me what male clinicians think is appropriate to say to a young female patient. Yeah, too rough. This state of vulnerability, exposure, even danger as a woman is why the hospital gown then became so prevalent in my subsequent artworks. I wanted to use the garment as a metaphor for perhaps how innocuous, everyday materials of medicine can be imbued with an aura of trauma that exists long after one leaves the hospital. An example of one such work is this piece called Healing House 3, which engages issues of surveillance, voyeurism, and memory. Here, the viewer is situated as a radiology technician or neurologist who must use the blacklight torch to peer inside of the fleshy windows of the body-shaped home to view the anatomy within. While gazing in through the gaps between the Venetian blinds, the blacklight activates the hospital gown pattern that has been silkscreened onto the surface of this house using luminescent ink. The pattern of this garment has been permanently affixed to the exterior in order to recall the incurable nature of multiple sclerosis or the enduring psychological impacts of having to wear the hospital gown. The X-sized windows in this home give us but segmented glimpses into the patient within. Although the enclosed figure is much more complete than typical MRI scans with a face, hair, and all of her limbs, her body is bent and twisted at strange angles, which I see as displaying the unease my sister endures in the MRI machine for hours on end. Transforming the images of medicine through artistic reimagining fulfills the urgent need to merge meaning with medicine and gives the patient agency to establish when, where, and how her body is gazed into, as well as what is found within. I see all of this work as the amalgamation of our collaborative efforts to reimagine medical images to include the perspectives of patients and caregivers. While creating artwork with Devan might not seem like a traditional form of caregiving, I use my body and my skills to tacitly educate viewers on what it is like to live with chronic illness and the impact a diagnosis may have on a family. By sharing this work with current and future physicians, I hope that Devan's past crass encounters with healthcare workers may never happen again. Devan's illness has taken on new complications in her years-long pursuit to conceive a child. She has had to discontinue much of her MS medication because its effects on a fetus are unknown. In order to avoid a serious relapse of her MS symptoms, she has felt incredible pressure to become pregnant quickly, which did not happen. Her experiences with infertility and its treatments have had an enormous impact on her body, mental health, and experience as a chronically ill patient. She is deemed high risk, not only because of her diagnosis, but also due to her advanced maternal age. Thus, Devan's medical monitoring has been taken to a whole new advanced level, to put it mildly. The images Devan shares with me now include time-lapse fluoroscopy images of contrast being injected into her uterus in order to check for blockages or twists in her fallopian tubes. These feel at once similar and also quite different than her MRI scans. And I wondered how her new set of doctors viewed her body and her desire to conceive. I was also extremely curious about these infertility treatments and their origins. It was at this exact moment in September of 2019 that I had a fortuitous meeting with Dr. Rebecca Duclos, the Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. with whom I disclosed my new research interest in fertility. She then set up a meeting with Christian because she knew the two of us have overlapping interests at the intersections of art and science. In my meeting with Christian, he mentioned Dr. Hugh Clark's fertility research laboratory at McGill University Health Center. I then set up a meeting with Dr. Clark, who agreed to allow me access into his laboratory and work with some of the scientists there. I then set up a meeting with said scientists, who include Sofia Granados Aparici, Karen Carvalho, and Hervana Kandasamy, who became my collaborating ArtSci partners. All this to say, this was not a straightforward application and response process like a lot of other artist residencies, but instead a stepping stone network of open-minded people who are also curious what happens when artists are in laboratories. I went to the laboratory a couple of times a week, starting in October. I closely listened to the scientists as they explained their experiments on the development of ovarian follicles. I then observed as they procured the tiny mouse ovaries, sequenced its DNA, gathered its microscopic ova, washed them in the experimental chemicals, fixed the material, and finally imaged the impact of the chemicals on the maturation of the ova using astoundingly high-tech microscopes and lasers. I asked a lot of questions. Like, what was each experiment hoping to discover? And they do a lot of experiments every week, so that was one of my main questions. Why do some ova look like this and others look like that? How are you able to achieve these colors? How does it feel to conduct research using the ova of mice? How does it feel conducting research using the ova of humans? How might what you're doing today impact people in the future? What is your experience as a woman in science? What are your future plans for this research and for yourself? I learned a lot from these answers. I learned that there is an immense amount of knowledge, embodied skills, and creativity within every scientist. It became clear that every experiment built off the successes and mostly failures of every experiment that came before it. I learned that in spite of its advanced robotic or technological portrayals in popular media, much of the process for these experiments was by hand or even by breath. These scientists pulled their own glass tubes, which I love because I've always wanted to work with glass, so I got to pull a couple tubes myself. And then they suck up the ova in these tiny glass tubes using synchronized eye, hand, and breath movements. Finally, it became abundantly clear the depth of creativity needed to even begin formulating an experiment, how to conduct it using incontestable scientific methods, and then accurately interpret the results in order to inform the next day's experiment. The hours are long and taxing. These scientists are clearly dedicated and passionate about their research. From our observations and conversations, I found out how much scientists and artists actually have in common. First and foremost, we discussed our common desire to effectively communicate with our communities. We all wanted the research that we do to have a wider impact beyond the studio and laboratory, because the implications of our research affect a lot of people. A core struggle we share is how to best communicate these topics outside of our own disciplines. Another commonality we discovered was our use of experimentation and chemistry to create the images of our research. Because I also was able to share my own studio with the scientists, and we went through the different studios where I was able to have a lot of excited explanations about how like-to-like oil to beeswax to toner is able to make the encaustic prints we were going to do, or how limestones are able to harness the hydrophilic and hydrophobic qualities of ink and water. or how the altered states of UV-sensitive emulsions can create silkscreen stencils. As with all experiments, our failures far outnumber the works exemplary enough to show in a gallery or to publish. However, we agreed that each risk taken, even if unsuccessful, then goes on to inform the next experiment and hopefully the ultimate creative solution. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention perhaps the more controversial commonalities between scientists and artists, like, say, the daily use of caustic carcinogenic materials, chemicals, and the often large amounts of waste produced from our research. Another example is the network of non-human lives implicated in our research processes. Obvious, I would say, being the countless number of lives, mouse lives, born and then sacrificed as the experimental material. The technicolor saturation of the images of their ovaries and ovum are almost otherworldly enough to make us forget about the very real bodies that went into making these images. What may be less obvious are the animal lives implicated in my own artistic practice. In printmaking and bookmaking, we use common materials like goat leather to bind our books, rabbit skin glue, cow bone folders, cochineal insect pigment, silk, and beeswax. An open acknowledgement of these practices brings further awareness to the networks and relations of human and non-human lives, and enables us to make fully informed and ethical choices about the materials we choose to use, and perhaps forge a new lineage of more gentle material practices. Above all, I learned that the purpose of science is also that of art, that the images we seek to produce attempt to capture the unseen, something beyond the tangible world, and speak to the fundamental essence of beings. So that's a lot of ideas to then include in an artwork. So I concluded that the collage aspect of encaustic toner transfer would best layer the images from the lab with my own drawings. I began by conducting an image-making session with the scientists in their own laboratory that was accessible for them as outsiders to fine art and to the printmaking process in particular. It also had to be fast enough to fit within our totally overloaded schedules, and maybe most importantly, it had to be immediate enough for everyone to partake in a creative play. After looking through the circular frame of the microscope so often, I wanted to retain this composition in the final artworks. So I decided to compose the images we would make within embroidery hoops. I brought these hoops into the lab, and we set to work gathering all of the common, overlooked daily ephemera that enable scientific research. These are things like nitrile gloves, beakers, syringes, specimen slides, hazard bags, tubing, and even our own hands. Considering the materials, shapes, and color schemes, we then arranged them on a Xerox scanner within the embroidery hoop and hit scan. The immediate nature of the scan allowed us to compose maybe over 30 different assemblages that afternoon. Here's a sampling. After printing off these Xerox scans, we could then transfer each layer onto silk or my homemade SCOBY kombucha paper, which I can answer questions about at the end. I was interested in bringing in another life form into the artwork. So here you can see the scientists in my studio pulling some prints for themselves. So in this process, you can see the encaustic medium, there you go, right here in front. So that is beeswax that's been dissolved in turpentine, and it's about the consistency of peanut butter. And we take the palette and scrape a very thin layer of the encaustic medium onto the surface of the silk or kombucha paper, and then press our Xerox onto the surface. let that dry for 24 hours, and come back and carefully peel off the backing paper, and hopefully, fingers crossed, the toner has been melted into the surface of the wax. So once you have that there, you can then add another layer of encaustic medium, add another layer of the Xerox, wait again for 24 hours, peel off the backing, and layer upon layer making these collages. So we're able to layer in this way the images from the lab along with my own bodily impressions. Historical anatomy woodcuts that I appropriated. The scientist's microscopy. And my sister's medical scans. It was, we agreed, really serendipitous just how often these images seem to layer over one another perfectly, as if they were meant to be seen together. As a final gesture, I embroidered measurement markers, the outlines of ova, or the bodies of mice into these works. And the mice are always embroidered using gold thread to point to the ultimate importance of their bodies in research. Finally, I glued each of these embroidery hoops together into a composition that was reminiscent of the shapes that I saw through the microscope. These arrangements are meant to be hung in space so that each viewer may walk around it and have a bodily encounter with ArtSci. And the great thing about this process is that the wax and the thinness of the paper and silk allows the image to be seen from both the front and the back, which is a unique aspect and why it's worth the effort to go through it instead of just printing it off on a digital printer. So what do these images do? They are at once illusionary and sculptural, but also utterly flat. I see an ingrained parallel between this work's flatness and Devan's MRI scans or the viewpoint through the microscope, all of which reduce the whole lived three-dimensional body into an utterly flat slice. My hope is that by layering the macro and micro perspectives over a multiplicity of circular vignettes, the works may take on a new dimensionality and point to the enormous amounts of care put forward by these scientists for the health and happiness of future patients. While these artworks are specifically inspired by my sister and her lived experiences with chronic illness, infertility, and medical surveillance, there is no explicit or recognizable portrait in any of these vignettes. And that is really important because I want there to be enough abstraction so that viewers can imagine themselves in this work, to see their own experiences and narratives mirrored back to them in the images. So what are the benefits of this kind of collaboration? I think in all instances of artists in laboratories, the benefits to the artists are very obvious. We get unprecedented access to space, equipment, information, experts, and images we never would have had access to otherwise. And the research that we do in the lab then becomes very obvious to everyone else through the very tangible artworks that are produced from this collaboration. So what I think is much less obvious is what the scientists get out of such a collaboration. You could even say that having to take the immense amount of time explaining their experiments to me might be a burden or hold them back from their work, their progress. So what's in it for them? One of the goals for my collaborating partners is to effectively communicate what happens in the lab with their wider community in a language that others can access. In an interview with Christian, Sofia Granados-Aparici states, "The expectation has always been the social impact of having a collaboration. How we as the scientists can really make the science come across in order to boost the impact in society of what we do. But also the benefit for us as scientists, because we're there working. Sometimes we don't really think about the social impact. We are too into the small molecules. We don't take the time to think about the bigger picture. This was our opportunity to do that. Concerning the perceived benefits of my time in the lab, my other collaborating partner, Karen, states, the first thing that comes to mind is still communication, but not in the sense of communicating science to the public, but helping me to communicate. I want to put myself out there and interact with people, because I think the Convergence Initiative and the collaboration has helped me out with this. It's on a personal level, but I think it shines light on the rest, how to organize ideas and work through things. So let's think about the bigger picture. It is important to note that the prints that came from this residency are not in the service of publicizing scientific findings. It is instead an interdisciplinary research methodology in its own right. It is not my goal to teach audiences how to do scientific research, nor is it really even to communicate the results of their very complex experiments, because I don't think my artwork does that, other than perhaps pointing to the mass amount of effort and material that goes into their experiments. It has always been my goal to better understand how those results of the laboratory form a nexus and a lineage of discoveries that finally goes on to impact people like my sister, the real-world receivers of care and treatment. In short, capturing the bigger picture. And if you weren't able to see, my sister did become pregnant during my residency, so I was able to use some of her ultrasounds in the artwork. Not that one, that's not what her fetus looks like, but other ones. The layering of women's bodies, medical scans, mice, and hands in these final pieces is meant to visually connect the restricted space of the laboratory with the wider implications of medical research on patients, families, and also on the researchers themselves. As for myself, I felt deeply connected to the historical intersections of science and anatomy. In the centuries between the inventions of the printing press and photography, artists, and printmakers specifically were the great communicators of scientific and anatomical discovery. These artists, not always content in a strict depiction of anatomy, often included metaphors to the divine, life, illness, birth, and death. As well, the source materials used to conduct their research, namely cadavers, are here clearly on display. I feel the necessity for layered, complex, and accessible images of research for a wider audience again today. Because when the languages and images of science no longer hold intelligibility to non-specialists, then when the leaps to link laboratory findings to the bigger picture aren't made, then it is all too easy for outsiders to shirk their importance. To break down our interdisciplinary barriers of expression, it was necessary to find common languages that enabled the open expression of two-way communication. Within our collaboration, the scientists weren't dictating their findings to me, but making them intelligible for an outsider like me to understand. For instance, they did this by outlining their step-by-step process, which Sophia did in my sketchbook here that I then incorporated into the final print there. Going through the experiment with me in real time, sharing their space, showing me their results, and patiently answering all of my questions. Likewise, I was able to share my own space with them and communicate my own artistic process through the hands-on experience of creating their own artworks. I feel the collaborative history of scientists and printmakers has come full circle. Our exchange of skills and knowledge for the expansion of the visual culture of science and medicine has already been recognized by a range of audiences. These binary revisions series of artworks are slated for display next week in Toronto at the Come Up to My Room Art Festival at the Gladstone Hotel, and then for a 6-month exhibition at the Iowa University Hospital and Clinic's Medical Museum. It is my hope that this work will continue to ask the uneasy questions on the interconnections of human and non-human lives in scientific research, patient experience, and the potentiality of artists within laboratories. Thank you. So, turn on the lights. I think we have some time for questions. It's like a lot of information.
Please feel free to ask questions to Darian. So,
Beautiful talk, first of all, thank you. I was very interested to see that you allowed the artists to contribute to the artistic process, because so often art scientists, they just go in, they do their own thing, and they leave.
Right.
So you talked a bit why you invited them in. Can you tell us more about how you instructed them? Because they did a lot of not instructing you, but communicating their scientific research to you. How did you communicate your artistic research to them?
Yeah. Well, I felt really committed from the get-go of this collaboration that it is always going to be a two-way street. I don't want there to be feelings that I'm going in and poaching their science for my own artistic use. So I was always interested in teaching the scientists also about my artistic practice and maybe how they could do some more on their own terms. And I've done this encaustic toner transfer workshops for large groups in classes and in conferences before. So I have kind of a 45-minute workshop on how to do it. It's really accessible. So that was another reason why I chose this as opposed to the much more technical lithography or silkscreen that I think takes a lot more upfront work. So also the Xerox scanner was so immediate. I mean, we looked at the scans right afterwards, like, oh yeah, that one's great. Oh wait, we should do another one like this. Like, okay, let's go back and rearrange this. Let's have some with our own hands coming in, and what do we want to do in here? It just felt so much like play, and I think art is so much about play, and I was glad that the scientists were able to capture that as well, and it didn't just feel like me teaching them something, that we were really doing this together. Yeah.
Did your experience in the lab change at all your perspective of the medical side of things, or what it would be like to approach the spaces like from the other side again?
From the medical humanities side?
Yeah, or your experience as a major support for your sister as well, and what a intensely negative experience a lot of that sounded like.
Yeah.
You kind of get a glimpse behind an aspect of the curtain there. So I wonder if that reframed anything or changed it at all.
It's still super fresh. So I think I'll have more perspective on how this will change my future work with my sister with a bit more time. I literally just finished this artwork 2 days ago. Some of these images are really new. So I have yet to see how it will impact my future work with my sister. As far as working in the lab, I had very little expectations. I'd never been inside a laboratory before. I didn't take college level labs or science courses. So that was a totally new atmosphere for me. And in my mind, I think maybe this was the same for a lot of people. I had just thought about clean spaces, very sober spaces where everyone's really focused. But that wasn't my experience at all. Everyone was so welcoming and congenial with each other. And the open floor plan of the lab, I saw it allowed people to see what each other is doing and be able to offer a lot of peer support, which is something that I also experience in the printmaking studio because we have to share all these huge pieces of equipment. And I think it's the exact same way in the laboratory as well. So I really love this open exchange of ideas that they were able to have in the lab. So that was another commonality that I felt between the two spaces. Yeah.
Very small question. Sorry, I missed the first part. Maybe this question is already answered. You mentioned a lot of ideas, interesting ideas. So I wonder if there is also a writing aspect of your work. Do you write, or do you, I don't know, elaborate in more framed way?
Yeah, That's also since starting my PhD. So my MFA was completely practice-based. I only had to write an artist statement. Otherwise, it was only the artwork. And that was my research process and outcome, was solely the artwork. But now that I'm in a PhD program, I am expected to write half a dissertation along with the artwork. So that has been a new experience, but one that I've actually really loved, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do a PhD in the first place, because I didn't get the experience of writing throughout my academic career before then. My sister and I have actually published a book on her. It's an edited volume, so there's 6 different authors, but she's the main editor, and we're all talking about the same set of MRI scans, her MRI scans from each of our different academic fields. So she's the ethicist and patient, I'm the artist and sister, there's a theologian, there's a doctor, there's an ethicist, and a couple other fields.
Is this completed yet?
Yes, it is completed, and it's on Amazon. Imaging and Imagining Illness. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, you started off by saying that we have a problem. I think talking about disease, which I agree. I think probably we're afraid of death. We're afraid of losing control.
Yeah.
So we don't want to talk about it. And so now that you've gone through this experience and interaction with the scientist, you have ideas sort of what could be done, how people could change their behavior, or what they could do to try to be able to better approach and open up, both those who may be the ones who are ill and the family members and the friends who are trying to figure out how to discuss it with them and so on and so forth. Because it seems to me that's a really that would be really wonderful benefit of all this work, just on a very sort of pragmatic level.
Right. So the question, if anybody didn't hear it, was how can thinking about my own experience of not being able to talk about illness with my sister, because it was just it was too much. It was so emotional that it was so much easier to not talk about it. So then we didn't, and that this is obviously a problem that me and my sister have solved through the creation of artwork, but is still a problem at large. I would say that I think creative communication is really key. It has been in our relationship, and acknowledging that linguistic-based communication isn't always going to be right for people. It might be drawing, it might be photography, it might be other kinds of expression that circumvents linguistic expression, maybe at first or entirely. So I do a lot of workshops with people, mixed groups of doctors and patients, community members, students, where we all create artist books. So in our creation of books, and students, you all made your own artist books. If you're in the Convergence Initiative, you know all about this. Being able to express yourself in a really different way that might also include text, but might not, can be a really, handing something to someone can be a lot easier than talking to them. So I would just recommend this process to anyone.
Any other question?
This is not going to be relative to your work, but you mentioned it during the talk. How do you make paper out of Scope?
Scope paper question has been raised. I brew my own kombucha at home, and then I put it in big tubs and put it next to the heater so that it grows much more quickly. And the SCOBY starts growing on top, and I wait until it's about maybe this thick, and then I take it out of the kombucha and throw it up on a piece of wood so that it dries really quickly and also stays stretched out. And then once you put a lot of the beeswax encaustic medium on it, so that's beeswax mixed with oil, it soaks into the material, the cellulose, and makes it flexible. And hopefully, I don't know, the first batch I made was only last semester, so hopefully it will stand the test of time, but we'll see.
Any reason why going from other types of pulps, whether hemp or something else, then went to live?
Yeah. I have worked with paper making a lot in a past life. I worked at a handmade invitations company where we made our own paper using a lot of different kinds of pulps. This one can be done at home with zero equipment. I just have a tub of kombucha and that's it. It's super easy. Anyone that comes in, like towards the end, it might smell a bit vinegary in my apartment. Sorry, but it's really simple to make. And I can grow it myself without cutting down any trees or anything like that. Yeah.
Okay, so if we don't have any other question, we will thank Darian for this amazing talk. And we invite you to stay because we order pizza. Because if you're not here, as usual. So please, yes, please stay here. We wanted to do this very like usually scientific seminars are. So is the talk and then